Imagine opening your email to find years of history deleted. Only a single email remains. A ransomware request for $2 million. You think to yourself, how could this happen to me? You see, there's two types of companies. Those that have been hacked and those that will be hacked. The weight of responsibility comes crashing down on you. It's the sort of responsibility you feel when your family is craving a delicious pizza. You finally open the box only to find the most cringeworthy topping that you mistakenly ordered. Join Pineapple on Pizza podcast as John and George, along with guest executives, discuss the most common and craziest cybersecurity risks, followed by actionable tips and strategies that can be implemented to protect your cyber risk pie. Pineapple on Pizza is hosted by Omnistruck.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Pineapple on Pizza. Today we have a great guest who is a serial enterprise partner with companies like Apple, Cisco, Dropbox, and Google, a linguistic artist fluent in both English and French, top-tier appreciator of employees, and the CEO at Advisory Solutions. Welcome to Anoush D'Orville.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here, John. And George.
It's great to have you. So we're just going to jump right in here. If cyber risk was a pizza and frameworks are the crust, what's the riskiest topping you've seen, and what topping would you equate that to?
So I thought a little bit about this question. I think the answer is probably buffalo chicken. And the main reason, because as you take the cybersecurity analogy, I think it's the perfect thing where you take a topping that has no business being on a pizza and cobble it together into something that is then consumed by people. And that's something that I think that we see quite a bit across our work in the general cybersecurity sphere, is that people are going out and buying all of these mismatched pieces, putting them on a vessel, and they don't necessarily go together. And in some cases aren't exactly the best strategic moves in terms of they decrease security in effect because there isn't a larger strategy behind it. So I'll stick with buffalo chicken on this one.
Well, and that's actually a pretty good one. I can see the sauce being like ranch, right? And then the cheese,
yeah, gross.
Maybe a little blue cheese on that one instead of anyways. Patent pending for on pizza.
If you think about, like, there are situations I'm sure that you guys had, is when you walk into and you look at all of these different patchworks that are there. You guys are in strategy. You see it all the time. It's sometimes things are done in isolation. You're like, I'm not sure how those two things ended up together. So I feel like that's a perfect metaphor for what a topping should not be on something as delicious as a pizza.
Yeah, no, you know what comes to mind, and this is great, because the very first thing for me, we often see in certain environments where the cybersecurity is so tight that they don't want any risks at all, that people can't get their work done at all, like where it creates problems. We still see that mostly, let's face it, traditional brick and mortar companies that still have technical debt and those sorts of things. And so what comes to mind for me is that, did they leave the bone in the chicken when they put it on the pizza? Because he's going to stop the user from eating it all, right? Because there shouldn't be any bones.
But then you need a change management board to agree to take out the bones before you can actually eat the pizza. So the bureaucracy itself, we can belabor the metaphor a bit here, but there's a bunch of things that we can pull for. You see, the buffalo chicken was a good one here. I will stake my claim that that'll be the best topping that you guys have on season 1 before you go into your season 2.
Definitely one of the more creative ones that we've heard. So that is great to hear. And so
I thank my local pizzeria for motivating me, just as a point of reference.
Did you take a look at their menu?
Shout out to Home Slice.
All right. So, as a CEO of the business, what keeps you up at night? What do you see? What do you see most people worrying about today?
So, I think that the growing convergence of, especially so as an MSP, I think we focus a lot on the Mac OS world. And the one thing that we see quite a bit of is this convergence of or at least move to the cloud, where the machine itself is less relevant than the actual cloud solutions that are in place. And so what ends up happening is that, especially where Macs are a smaller portion of the larger enterprise strategy, what tends to happen is that things are just thrown into place in order to check a bunch of boxes. Like enterprise says this for SCCM, they have a 30-person team, and then they bring in a contractor for just the Macs. And then all of a sudden you have these 80, 90 machines that are usually used by senior leadership in these organizations that become these huge vectors for vulnerability. And so I think it's almost out of sight, out of mind. And the more people are given the choice, whether it's in higher ed, whether it's in enterprise, whether it's a nonprofit, if you don't look at security or even just IT strategy as a whole in a universal way, that for us is the biggest concern whenever we manage a client. And then we go back to all of these concepts like change management, introducing different tools that may not be the right tool set for the Macs, but they are for the Windows, and how they try and shoehorn those things in. Those tend to be huge points of concern for us. And I think the other piece of it is, with this move towards security questionnaires for everything, right? There's 30-page questionnaires of what do you do for X, Y, and Z. I think the other corollary side to that are companies that may be all Mac, for example, but just get tools in order to get SOC 2 compliance, right? They're like, yep, we have these policies that Vanta has spit out for us, and we put in an AV, and we have an MDM, and okay, we're done. But there's no actual thought that is put behind bringing all of those pieces together under one large overarching summary. Or strategy, excuse me. So I think those are really two different areas that we look at, two very distinct problem sets that often have the largest impediments to change. And one of the biggest tasks that we have going in and helping people align themselves a little bit to a more sort of transparent way of looking at security for the whole organization.
That's definitely one of the reasons that we take a look at these frameworks and how to apply them across networks or devices, whether they be Macs, PCs, or whatever. Those frameworks, they're getting to be more standardized and really can be applied and help make sure that those bases are covered. Of course, there's many times that we see the checkbox theater or somebody just saying, I've met these. But with the right way of doing it, those cybersecurity questionnaires that you're talking about become much easier and built in. Yeah. I mean, you just point to your policies, and I think that's probably that everyone listening to this, and you guys see quite a bit, is that how do you get organizational buy-in? And that's also one of the biggest challenges, right? Because it's not just IT strategy, right? But IT strategy is now the domain of finance. It's now the domain of operations. It's now the domain of people ops. It's now everyone's domain. And because it all links together, you need buy-in from every single department. Otherwise, you get this piecemeal approach. And I think that, when we talk about like what concerns us, what worries us whenever we inherit a situation like that, those are the first things that we have to tackle. Is first you educate, and then you get buy-in, and then everything else can flow from there. But you also have companies, for example, that will do half of it, right? They'll be like, oh, we got an MDM, but SSO can wait because, Okta's too expensive, and Google Workspace SSO or Azure SSO, we're not so interested in doing it just now. We have to buy our licenses. There's the concept of SSO tax. All of these things are extremely difficult concepts to be able to take an organization that doesn't think about security in a structured, thoughtful way and bring them to a place where like true compliance and security is at the forefront of a lot of their departmental decisions.
I think the enlightening part of that, let's call them what they are, the frameworks, is that at least in this country, we love squishy when it comes to risk management. So, we're a country that absolutely has a great structure in terms of having checks and balances. So we have judges and we have laws and those sorts of things. So a lot of these, what we call statutory requirements, the things that are required by law, comparatively to industry requirements, you're still all pointing to some kind of a foundational framework. And what's interesting about it is in the technical world, right? We like prescriptive, right? If you're talking to a tech, right? Like, no. Is it blue or is it red? Very analytical in nature. Yet now with cybersecurity becoming more litigious, now it goes into the argument sense of, the American way is to argue, right? So back in the courtroom, right, the worst thing you can do is be prescriptive, and so they use the word reasonable. What's reasonable, right? And generally, that's what you learn as cyber becomes more litigious. Something that's really hard for the technical person to grasp, I think, is when you approach them and say, "Well, do what's reasonable." Well, wait a second, no, blue or red? No, we got to do what's reasonable. What do you think is reasonable? Right? Yeah. And that's like, you want to see a technical person's head explode, right? That's one way to do it. Is well, wait a second, no, it's either going to be right or it's going to be wrong. It can sometimes be a bit of a challenge, I think, in the world of what we consider to be prescriptive controls. Like an ISO 27001 is going to have some pretty prescriptive controls. The FedRAMP and the NIST body of work as it relates to prescriptive controls at certain levels. But you get into NIST CSF and you get into, which is kind of ruling the cyber risk world in the US anyway, because that's kind of the standard that we're headed towards. It's all about reasonableness. So how do you get somebody has to decide at a business what is reasonable? And I think that's kind of always the challenge, isn't it? Is like, so here we are prescriptively wanting to configure it this way, and it's going to be this way. Oh, well, you may have just broken the law. We need to involve the attorney. What? The attorney?
Yeah.
Well, what are you talking about? I'm a technical person. I don't want to meet with the attorney, right? And so just kind of going through those throes of just getting comfortable, in this new world. And I think what we're learning is that frameworks are great, but somebody still has to make a decision.
Right. And everyone has to understand it. I think you bring up actually a really interesting point in terms of, the evolution certainly that we've seen over the last 5 years and exponentially increasing over probably the last 2 to 3 is that for people within the MSP space, if you haven't adapted, and I know cybersecurity is this like big hulking overarching term, like the word hacking, right? Like it doesn't mean anything in isolation and it means everything all at once. But if you do not adapt your practice to understand all of those, what I mentioned, those departmental needs, right? You have to be able to get finance and you have to be able to get legal in, because those frameworks, Frank, we're going through our SOC 2 as we speak now, right? Every day I have packed meetings of field work that's being done. And all of those in many respects touch all of these different aspects of the business, sometimes down to like, did we do background checks on people? That has nothing to do with IT. But did we onboard that person with a specific roadmap? And did we then validate it? Was there a change management order put in place into our system and a ticket that followed it? Those are all pieces that flow out of it. So I think that the modern day IT company, not the IT person, right? But the IT company has to be able to have an element of understanding around security and stakeholder buy-in to be able to be successful, at least in the world that we live in today. And that's one of the things that maybe COVID accelerated in a lot of respects, where companies that were so comfortable in being in place saying, oh, we've spent, $100,000 on our network stack and we have all these incredibly beautiful VLANs and everything is segmented off. Well, cool, but that doesn't mean anything when your laptop walks out of that office. So I think everyone has flipped that formula on its head. And to go to your point, George, I think has looked at it from this multi-departmental framework, at least in the world that we live in, right? It may not be everywhere, but it's in the world that we live in, which are usually small and medium-sized businesses. They tend to hew to the creative, right? Stereotype a Mac company. That's generally who we work with. So you're going to have people that are a little bit more tech forward looking, but never used to talk about security. Now it's literally all they talk about because it's all their clients talk about. So it's permeating, and we have to educate ourselves, I think, in all of those frameworks, at least to a cursory enough detail that you can sit down in front of general counsel or CFO and be like, here's the reasons why money, here's the reasons why legal, and then you can get a whole team of buy-in.
Yeah. Isn't that always the hard part though, is the buy-in, right? They can say that they're doing it, but whether they have bad behavior or not is often a cultural issue. So, and if you don't have control over those departments of your customers, right? So, I mean, the customer is going to have to make those decisions, and and let's face it, the traditional CEO, and I'm gray hair, right? But the traditional CEO tends to be a little bit older, but none of them are always thinking about cybersecurity because there was a kind of a point in time, and that's changing now, thank goodness, because there's younger leaders that are more technology savvy. But a lot of them would say, "Oh, it's got a blinking light. No, send it over to the IT guy." I don't run the other way, as CEO or CMO, whoever it is. Oh, that's an IT problem. No, I don't know tech. Those sorts of claims, and so now that's what lawmakers are saying, and why we see these frameworks. Right, is they're saying that's enough. CEOs, I'm sorry, if your company has a problem with marketing or with finance, you're rolling up your sleeves and you're getting in there. You just can't say, "Oh, IT, no, throw it over the fence," right? And so I think that's the kind of the core reason behind some of these laws is that there's a generational change happening in leadership, and it is somewhat invigorating to see new CEOs. But seeing older CEOs understand they have to be involved is more exciting because at least they're changing, right? So, and
that was the interesting.
And are you seeing that in your customer base where the owners are, oh, I don't know the tech, and they just kind of not even interested at all in learning even a little bit?
So what's been interesting in our world is that, again, I'll go back to, stereotype who our clients are. It's pretty easy to figure out. We worked with a lot of startups in the last 3 years, certainly. And the inevitably younger hue of CEO that came with a lot of these startups, the era of a lot of free money, frankly, that was flowing around for 3 years, responsibly or irresponsibly, brought about, I think, a different mindset around how technology was leveraged, and not always for the better. But I do think that many of the enterprises took notice because these companies were raking in hundreds of millions of dollars of investments, and all of a sudden presenting a challenge to some of the more established enterprise companies that had these like long, slow trajectories of 50, 60-year growth. And so the adaptability to the ecosystem, I think, forced a lot of those enterprise teams to rethink their approach to technology. Now, as we all know, change in a large enterprise is extremely slow and laborious, but that change was even talked about. Like, I'll go back to Macs being an enterprise. The fact that Macs are even allowed in like some of the big law firms, or Macs were allowed in some of the big healthcare enterprise companies, that represented a seismic change of thinking around what was and was not secure. And that very definition then permeates all of the other strategic questions. So I would say, the short answer to your question, George, is that, 100%. We see it across young, old companies. It doesn't really make a difference. I would say more seasoned leadership versus younger leadership. Everyone, I think, understands at this point that technology is the key to it. We used to walk around for our pitches, and I'd go to the firewall and I'd hold the Ethernet cable and I'd be like, "This is why IT is important. If I unplug this, would you be able to go about your day?" And everyone's like, "Oh yeah, that's a good point," right? It was like it was the easiest point to prove of why technology was so important. But now you don't even need to make that argument because it has become understood that whether it's Zoom, whether it's Wi-Fi, whether it's security, email, accessibility, collaboration, all of those are strategic decisions. I think the John Silverbeard may take umbrage a little bit with the gray hair CEO, the older CEO. I saw him smile on there. I just wanted to point that out.
It's still black on top, but I've had my experience.
Yeah, exactly. It's trickle down experience.
That's right.
Maybe I should have kept the mustache for the week. All the meetings, everyone had to so far. But
you got Zoom filters if you'd like.
I suppose I could have a mustache, but beard I can't pull off as well. But my go-to.
How can I pull mine off? So Anoush, tell us more about what Advisory Solutions does for their clients, so that you help them with the regulatory requirements with the Macs. I mean, tell us a little bit more about what you guys do.
So Advisory is a pretty traditional MSP, a managed services provider. So we are, in the easiest way to describe it, a managed services provider is basically like an outsourced IT department. Our goal is to do everything from designing infrastructure, building it, implementing it, and supporting it. So the way that we generally look at IT as a whole. We call it sort of IT strategy, which is, again, this big hulking, all-encompassing term, but it's kind of built on three pillars, which is endpoint security and management, identity security and management, and network security and management. And ultimately, how those three things interact with one another is what forms the basis of good IT strategy, right? So we'll generally work in, we have a pretty standard stack of stuff that we work with. We're huge Jamf proponents, we're huge Okta proponents, and we're huge Cisco Meraki proponents. And all of those are strategically chosen, of course, because we generally think that they're best in class. But for us, they're also really helpful because they tend to be really good one-to-many solutions. And for a team of 18 people with several thousand endpoints under management, you need good one-to-many solutions, right? There's a lot of API work, there's a lot of and security that goes along with that. But we don't want to repeat manual tasks. And so much of what we do has to be centralized in the security stack that we do. So within each of those buckets, there's obviously a ton of different things, but our goal is to really help people understand through those simple lenses, what are the things that you need to achieve? Change is not overnight. And that's why, as a managed services provider, and frankly, how I eat dinner, right, is that we do this over time. This is an iterative process that changes with technology as technology changes. And we help organizations adapt to that change in a way that I'd like to think is pretty seamless for them. I think that's a 30-second elevator pitch. How'd I do?
Great. And it's interesting I see Jamf, and I always Mac, right? It's always kind of the default on that. PSA, whatever your stack is in IT services, right? So John and I own an IT managed service company, so we know the ups, the downs, the backs and the forths. But one thing that we're wholly aware of is that cybersecurity problems are just constant for an IT service provider, starting with the fear of, you try to be helpful, tell your customer, here's some things you really need to do, right? If you say, I don't have the budget. I mean, no, you really need to do that. Well, maybe next year, right? And then, let's face it, some of them have short memories and they have an issue. And if they had done what you had suggested, they wouldn't have an issue. And immediately they're pointing how could you let this happen to me? You're my IT service provider, right? How come somebody got in? I thought you were doing your job. And so the tides of the relationship can change. And in talking to a lot of MSPs, I'm curious if you have a similar challenge, which is even if you are not essentially selling your security services because customers keep saying no. Often do you find that they come back and go, you're not doing that for us when they actually have a problem. I thought you were doing that for us. I thought you were taking care of all those things, right? So is that still the case? Because that's what it was for us. And the problem we have to try to resolve. So
what's interesting is it actually manifests itself in two ways. It's whenever we advocate ongoing education. So whether it is security trainings, right? And security trainings have gotten great. So a lot of these companies have gone out and bought production companies. So they're not these like mundane, horrible 12-minute videos of us spotting a spoof. Like there's actually good content out there. And so we'll have some clients come to us and say, well, why don't you just do the training? All right, cool. But like, that doesn't necessarily me droning on for an hour or 45 minutes sitting telling everyone this is how you spot a spoof or a phishing campaign, or don't go buy that gift card when your CEO texts you and says, I need these Apple gift cards. Those types of things aren't as effective as just these little pockets of training that are more importantly tied to larger initiatives, right? So those are the building blocks, and that's where we get the buy-in. All right, you start with a training because that's the check mark that you need to do for your compliance frameworks. But then to actually make people interested in the training, what we found was phishing campaigns are actually like a really fun way of getting everyone involved, because we won't tell anyone. Obviously, 2 or 3 people will know, and sometimes those 2 or 3 people that know end up falling for it. But we won't tell anyone. And then when you do the presentations around it during phishing, like during quarterly or semi-annual meetings, everyone is always like, oh, was it you? Was it you? Was it you? There's a different component to it. But the idea there is, yes, it's cute and it's fun on the one part where people feel like, oh, they got me. But on the other part, it helps inform leadership to show, okay, when you have 16% of your company giving away credentials, don't worry, there's MFA and all of those things, but that only protects you to a certain extent, right? So you have to now use that evidence-based approach in order to get leadership to free up some of the maybe extra budgetary funds that would be required for additional resources to put things in like, I don't know, secure internet gateways running on the Macs themselves. We implement Cisco Umbrella, for example, as a standard for a lot of companies that want sort of that DNS layer management. And so that helps understand that this isn't just us throwing a bunch of stuff out at them with all these extra costs, but one thing begets another, and you have to look at it through that rubric. Otherwise, it's just you're shouting into a void.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's part of the training problem as well. I mean, yeah, there's some great training out there, but are people really comprehending and consuming it? It can be bland from time to time, but and to some degree, I always wonder, maybe we're kind of going to be stuck in the training area until Tom Hanks comes back and does "You've Got Viruses" with the Meg Ryan reprise. That they would notice, right? Because it would be a movie, and people would remember. But unfortunately, Hollywood always butchers those things. So maybe there is no answer for the training that people will remember.
Throw $100 million at James Cameron. He'll make a good one. Don't worry. Yeah. We'll all have the best security training videos in the world.
So it's not Avatar, it's Avast.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's training is always one of those things that, we always say that a company can spend all the money that they want, but it takes one person to answer one of those text messages. It takes someone to pick up a phone and give away information. It takes a lack of understanding. Like, GDPR is its own beast. We talked a lot about the US side of the framework and regulations, but, a lot of our clients, especially design agencies, creative agencies, things like that, tend to have developers or even offices in European capitals. And so now all of a sudden you have to rethink the way that you do infrastructure in order to comply with what may be an opaque set of regulations. So I think that those are all, GDPR is great. Like, I think from a personal standpoint, it is a really, really important framework for people to be able to reclaim their own data. But now companies have to contend with this, and a lack of understanding around those things are what's really important. So an employee may accidentally send someone's email address and mailing address to someone else within the company. Well, now you very well may have just had a PII violation, right? It doesn't need to be as blatant as a social security number or credit card number. So I think the training of just giving people that framework is really, really important, but one of the steps of many in order to help companies get to a place where they're not unnecessarily exposing themselves to legal and financial implications around it. Because GDPR is onerous if you screw up there.
It is. And I think that's a big part of the point we've been on the journey long enough to understand that a lot of those problems are generally not cybersecurity or risks or hacks, are from a culture that I think, or a previous culture that really focused on, stopping the hacker. Who is unstoppable, by the way. There's no such thing as stopping a hacker completely, as, there's scenarios that we could paint millions of scenarios. But, ultimately these laws like GDPR and even, CCPA in California, VC, the Virginia law, Denver, or Colorado area as well. So there's a lot of cybersecurity firms in Denver on comprehensive data privacy. I mean, the regulatory train is coming, and let's face it, service providers are kind of tied to the tracks, right? And so that will be the big change departmentally, because now, let's use a fictitious name. Let's call her Alexa. Hopefully none of you have one sitting next to your desk. So Alexa in marketing decides to send out a solicitation to a lead list, and she's breaking the laws in some of these states or in GDPR, collecting information, right? So, and maybe she works for a healthcare entity, and HIPAA covers it. No, it doesn't. There are some gaps between HIPAA and some of these, like California data privacy law, and then you got New York Shield on top of that if you're in New York. But California and New York are the states that we point to as, like somebody has to know this stuff, and that's what our superpower has been, is trying to, kind of be that Sherpa and that navigator for the service provider. But what about the end customer? And the behavior they don't even know that they have that's bad, like in marketing and these other departments. And that was always the struggle that I had in helping the customer base as a managed service provider, And one of the impetus for why we do what we do is because, hey, somebody's got to take the risk on, right? So how about us? Transfer some of that risk to us. It's almost like the telco agency, right? You know what? Have you had a telco agency before, or been involved in telcos selling circuits? And it's part of the IT landscape. Something about, well, generally they're split up as agencies. You don't actually become a competitive local exchange carrier, do you? No.
Yeah.
There's like FCC and there's all these regulations, right? And so, so just at some point, that's where we're going to be. Is there's going to have to be there's got to be some kind of momentum there. And when you talk about cyber risk, the reality is that it's the litigious part of it, or the insurances and the risk part of it, are what a lot of CEOs and board members even are being held accountable for in some legislation. So ought to be interesting to see how much more attentive they are as these laws.
That's why I think that there has to be an evolution in terms of what people understand as IT, right? The initial evolution was, I remember when we used to have backup as an argument. Do you need backup, right? This is 25 years ago. Then that evolved to now it's, security. How much security do you need? But the fact is that if you're a services provider, they're all grounded in the same principle, which is, what are the strategies that you have to create security and redundancy for your purview, right? The customers that you work with, the staff that you work with. And if you do not evolve to understand each of those frameworks, we don't have a product. Doing SOC 2 for us is more of an exercise of understanding what our clients go through, and also to get that stamp of approval, right? It's, in many respects, it's a piece of paper that comes out of it to say, yeah, these guys follow the things that they follow, and we attest that those policies are enforced. But I think right now that's ultimately the challenge that many IT services companies need to face, is that they need to understand things that have not traditionally been part of that. And if we accept that IT is now part of this larger business strategy, then we have to understand all the business strategy implications to IT and the IT implications to business strategy.
Yeah. And to that point, right, that means you got to go to events and seminars, and you got to learn about those things, and maybe even find some helpers, right? So can you tell me then, what events do you go to understand the information and actually be ready for your customers for these situations?
So it's, I'm going to say a young company, but not necessarily a young company. We're about 6.5 years old now. We just started going to events, because before that, financially and human capital wise, it was an impossibility to go to a conference for 3 days. And it was last year was the first time we went to JNUC, the Jamf Nation User Conference. We went to Okta's conference, because thankfully those here in New York made things a little easier. But we generally will we're starting to move towards a place where now our company is fleshed out and structured in a way that we have subject matter experts in those specific fields, and particularly as it relates to specific products. So Okta, security, things like that. And we're starting to go out a little bit more into it. The nice piece that we have as a managed services provider is that, because we have a wide diversity of clients, as small sometimes as a 5-person foundation, all the way up to a 2,000-person healthcare company, of which we're a piece of, we do learn quite a bit and absorb quite a bit from different strategic approaches where we nestle into an existing IT department. And that helps us understand larger strategic implications for smaller companies, right? You may have, I can name drop all of them, but like, you may have EPM products that are out there that we have not necessarily ever thought to implement on the Mac side, but we see it in these enterprises. And now we can think, okay, how do we replace 1 or 2 products to be able to nestle this in? Because this checks off some of the needs that we have from an automation and reporting standpoint, up to some sort of SIEM or something like that. So the conferences are a part that we're starting to do. There are quite a few really good Mac conferences, but they tend to be really distributed around the world. So I don't know that we're at the place yet that I can start going to, Objective by the Sea in Barcelona or Hawaii, as they've had it in the past. Sounds nice, but my CPA would be really upset about that tax write-off that I tried to pull from a week-long vacation to any of those places. So for now, JNUC and the Okta conferences are probably part of the piece. The other one that I want to throw out there are the user groups, right? User groups are a really, really helpful way of understanding how your peers are doing things. In the world that we live in, especially as MSPs or even just people directly or tangentially related to IT, user groups, whether they're the JF user groups, Okta user groups, things like that, those meetups tend to be really, really informational in terms of what other people are doing and how they're doing it. So the conferences are one thing, but those are a little bit more like pageantry. I think once you get to the user group level, you actually get into practice. And I think that they have their place in the learning landscape for us to be able to continuously evolve alongside what you may get from the more lofty presentations and vendor booths and things like that at some of the bigger conferences.
Yeah, I can see that. I remember also looking back in our MSP days and having to kind of do some bootstrap techniques to get to events. There was one event that we realized was channel friendly, but also kind of service provider friendly, and they paid for your airfare and they paid for your hotel and pretty much all your expenses. But you had to sign a contract where you had to be their captive. It's almost like a timeshare, like getting sold a timeshare. Yeah. You were kind of like a captive audience, so you had to commit to those 3 days. And of course, they're bringing different kind of vendors to your to the table. Like your Kaseya or your ConnectWise or whomever is hot in the MSP space. But that was always the challenge that we faced. And so, but as we kind of matured, we got to look more towards the future, right? And it was about the stage that you're at where we started to, okay, what excites us about the future? So what excites you about it? You're probably starting to look a little bit more forward these days. Yeah,
I think it's sort of a theme of a lot of what I've said throughout our discussion here. It's been that IT is no longer the purview of the dark closet in the back with a lot of lights blinking on switches. It's now become, you have a seat at the table. IT, we see this in a lot of organizations, schools, nonprofits, that IT is now part of leadership committees. And because all of those decisions that are made in essence need to funnel through IT. Is this possible? Is this secure? Is this new vendor we're bringing on compliant with what we're testing that we're doing on some of these frameworks? So it's been a huge breath of fresh air, certainly for us as an MSP, going back to the days of when I started in IT, which was with Apple back in 1999, where I was in higher ed. Then IT was this weird siloed thing where there would only be a few people that would feel comfortable talking to you. And I learned very quickly that you really have to be able to translate complex thoughts and processes into digestible pieces based on who you were speaking to, right? There were certain things that were important to highlight. So now that language has shifted where the language of IT is part and parcel of a lot of these leadership meetings. It's part and parcel of a lot of the vision and budgets that are being built for companies. Startups are not waiting until there are 100 people to then now call an MSP and be like, hey, we think we should probably do some SSO or MDM at this point. You're like, how do you manage your computers now? They're like, well, I don't know. The guy has it and sends it back, hopefully. So that shift has been incredibly encouraging, where we're not doing as much like advocating for the need for IT, but we're doing a lot more conversation about the strategic implementation of IT. And that's where we as a company thrive. And I think that's where anyone in the IT space thrives, is when you can have a conversation about what needs to be done rather than why it needs to be done.
But can you tell us, we talked a lot about the business and that side of everything. What about you? Right? We know that you're in the New York area, but tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I was born and raised in New York. I tried to leave multiple times. It didn't work. Just kept coming back to the point where I did undergrad at NYU at business school. I did my master's at NYU in international relations, so nothing to do with computers. But when I was younger, I'd always been, maybe to my parents' credit, but they worked at the UN and they always had a love for Macs. It was like this weird thing. Everything in the UN at that point were Wang computers. And so I, cut my teeth with MS-DOS on United Nations computers, learning how to navigate to directories, which I thought was super cool. And I'd always wanted to work at Apple because of my exposure to it. And so I got a job my second day of college. Apple was doing a demo on site. I went up to them and I was like, I would like a job with you. And my boss had incredible vision, and he's like, why don't you come for an interview? And then the next day I was NYU's campus rep for Apple for 4 years, and then went on to oversee some of the other campuses like FIT, New School, Parsons, and NYU here in New York. When I asked for a raise, he fired me, but was kind enough to use me as a contractor. Then he said, why don't you just go start your own thing? So a colleague of mine at Apple and I started our first MSP in 2004 after we were, fired from Apple. And our first clients were a lot of these universities and department heads that needed help understanding, how you put a G3 in place and why the University of Virginia was able to build a supercomputer off of G4s and how do they do that at NYU Medical. Those types of things it was really fun because we got to play practitioner and get paid a little bit better than we were getting paid as lowly Apple employees at that point. So I spent a lot of time doing that. I lived and worked in West Africa for a little while in a public-private partnership doing infrastructure development. So we were doing broadband over power lines to help sort of provide larger access via the electricity grid to various different parts of Ghana. And that was always the focus of my studies, is how to use technology as the catalyst for economic development. And then ultimately came back after 4 years there, and a whole many stories that would be its own podcast, I think. And then came back and decided that working with government entities probably was a little bit more stressful and exhausting than I wanted. So went back and did various iterations of MSPs until I founded Advisory on my own in 2016. And we are here today.
Gotcha. And I imagine that, like most people, like most of us, right, there's got to be some passion that you have, that's something you do outside of work, right? What's yours?
So I would have answered this question very differently almost 4 years ago. I should say 4.5 years ago. But so these days, it is just purely, I have a soon to be 4-year-old daughter. COVID was a weird time to also have a kid because you were sort of hamstrung in this like small space. Remember, I live in New York. And so it was a little bit different during that period where that was really the time to like travel, say go to the Philippines for 2 months and go hang out, and be able to work from there. But, we were pretty much grounded here for a number of reasons, not least of which was Advisory was still there, and we probably needed Advisory to keep humming along. So for now, it's really just been family. I'm an avid snowboarder. This season has been phenomenal. So whenever I can sneak away, I will always do that, especially if there's backcountry involved. Big proponent of teetering as close to the edge of getting in trouble with my family as I possibly can when it comes to that stuff. But other than that, now that we can travel again, that will be back in my future. So
I was going to say, I'm right at the base of the Sierra Nevadas. And I'd say, come on out to Tahoe and do some skiing, but we got a 60-foot base and all of the lifts are buried. So the chairs. I
saw pictures. The 10-foot tunnels that you have to go through to get out of houses over there is nuts. That's my dream in a sense.
They're pretty crazy. They were pretty normal years ago. It's been a while. We had another kind of a tunnel winter in the Tahoe area. I don't live in Tahoe, but I've been up there enough. And it's kind of funny because I remember there was a big snowstorm on the East Coast. It's like 2 feet of snow on the East Coast. It's ridiculous. They can't believe how much snow there is. I think this was 5 or 6 years ago. And somebody from Tahoe created a little image and posted it and said, in Tahoe, we call that Friday.
Yeah. No, but it's, one might wonder why I hadn't even it's the classic discussion when my wife and I first met. I was like, are you a beach or mountain person? And this was going to be the great determinant about our future. She looked at me, she goes, beach, what the hell are you talking about? And I was like, oh, wow. So we had a lot of figuring out to do. And that was part of, how we compromised. But thankfully she's also a good snowboarder now turned skier. But I think the challenge, the nice thing with snowboarding for me was always, especially in doing backcountry stuff, it's the perfect way to sort of tune out, right? That's why for me, it was almost meditation in the sense that every turn, you have to focus on every turn. There's no thinking about anything else. It doesn't, for someone who runs a business, and John started by saying almost serial entrepreneur, I would probably say I've had 4 or 5 different companies in my life in various different ways, but whenever you do that, your brain's always working. I'm sure you two know it very well, right? What can you do better? How can you grow? should you have done something different with this client? Is there a different client you should go? It's this thing. What are your HR problems? Whatever it may be, all of these things are always swirling around in your mind. And I think for me, being able to find things like that focus you and hone you on living in that moment, I don't think I've ever had that same level of happiness as I do when I'm snowboarding and have to worry about, my next turn could be a treat. So that's basically how I try and how it's also cathartic for me as a way of getting away from the stresses of work.
Yeah, I can relate, especially, I've got a 6-year-old myself, so, I can understand, how lifestyle matters. And when you try to do things outside, right, whether it's snowboarding or what have you, it becomes part of your foundation, right? Your respite and those sorts of things. So thank you so much for sharing the personal side of you. And it's great to hear more about what your company is doing. But, and I'm sure our listeners are going to be interested in possibly trying to find you in the future. So what's the best way to get a hold of you these days?
So I'm terrible at all things social media, but I will say that I'm on LinkedIn, Anoush D'Orville. I have an accent in my name, but on LinkedIn, it's just my name spelled out. And also through our website, which is either advisory.nyc, or if you are anti-New York, it's advisorymsp.com. Both lead to the same place.
Now, I love the TLD. I love the NYC TLD. I do. So, there's another route, so to speak.
Apparently, our SEO people said that it wasn't good. We had to change it to .com, which is where advisorymsp.com came about. So I had to disaggregate myself from my roots.
Yeah, that I understand. Yeah, there's not always the marketing teams. They certainly love those .coms. How's that? So
that's right.
All right.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, we really do appreciate your participation in our podcast, and we're absolutely intrigued by the new things that we learn in every one of these experiences. So thank you again so much for bringing to light some of the challenges that you faced in cyber risk, as well as what your organization does to help people with technology as well as security. Some wonderful things that you're doing at Advisory MSP, and we appreciate you as well as your time. So for our audience, thank you. This has been another great episode of Pineapple on Pizza. If you've learned something today, whether you have laughed or you have cried in some cases, we had those situations where, it's come close when you start to learn about how some of these attacks happen. Please tell somebody about our podcast. Thank you again, Anoush D'Orville, for joining us today. And this has been another amazing episode of Pineapple on Pizza with John and George. Thanks, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all for joining another great episode of Pineapple on Pizza. You can find show notes, links, and resources by visiting omnistruct.com/blog. And a huge thank you to all who are preventatively protecting organizations from cyber threats.